All right, today's topic's on the Informed. We're going to do a double up. We've got the A team joining us, Ian Cook from I Cook Foods, director of, and for the infamous scandal of the Sludgate affair. And we've also got Caroline Council, one of the leading law practitioners in Australia. Now, our topics today, we're going to do a double. Our first one is going to be, does a planned visit to Taiwan by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, put the US and China on a collision course for war if, as the China believe, the US and Pelosi are violating Chinese airspace, and there've actually been some rhetoric that they may have the right to shoot down Pelosi's plane. And the second topic we'll be discussing is Labor's Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, right when he says the time for action is now to enshrine Labor's 43% emissions reduction target into law. Welcome, Caroline. Welcome, Ian.
Good day, Michael.
Now, China, Pelosi going to visit Taiwan. Is this overly antagonistic? Is this a thumb in the eye? Do we back down? How do we look at this?
The Chinese are going to see it as antagonistic. I think the whole Taiwan issue is quite interesting because both claim to be the Republic of China. You have a look at a passport of someone out of Taiwan, it says the Republic of China. And China says Taiwan is part of China. And the difference is purely political. One is a democracy and governing itself, and the other isn't. I don't know that China would take a plane down unless they specifically wanted to go to war, because that would probably trigger that sort of reaction from America. I think the Chinese will do it in their own good time. I think they'll starve them out if they can.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's a pretty drastic act to take down a plane. Of course, we've seen precedents of that. We've seen the Russians do it over Ukraine. So I just think this is just that typical standoff, chesting each other, waving fingers and pointing guns, but not necessarily firing those guns, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a risk for China, even though we know that they are becoming increasingly aggressive in the region. But it's a step to go from we can to we will.
I think the other thing to keep in mind that I think about when we're dealing with China in situations like this is that Xi Jinping would have just as many political challenges. I mean, we tend to see him as being the leader and the one that's up there. He's only there because he's played the political game internally well. He was and got himself the position of president. It'll really boil down to what the hierarchy of the military think. And if some of the old generals really wanted to rattle the saber or show the world that they now are a world power, then anything could happen.
It's some fairly frightening saber rattling, though, when we think of the consequences. But China are also very good at playing the long game compared to the rest of the world. How do they save face, which is very important in Chinese culture, should Pelosi turn up?
I think there's going to be more rhetoric. I think they're going to issue stern warnings, and if they don't take action, and decisive action and potentially fatal action, there's going to be a lot of rhetoric around, how dare you, you've abused our sovereignty, and threatened sanctions, etc. That's where they'll have to go next.
Are they claiming the airspace over all of Taiwan, or only the airspace they would fly over to get to Taiwan?
I think their claim was the airspace over Taiwan is their sovereign airspace, the same as any Chinese territory. But I'm unsure on that. But if this level of rhetoric is happening in public, would it be more or less behind the scenes, do you think?
No, I think this is for public consumption. I think this is for the Chinese themselves. And they like to they like to have a crack at the Americans and the American system whenever they can too, for internal reasons.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next topic. Is it time now, as Chris Bowen has said, to enshrine Labor's 43% emissions reduction target into law? And given the Greens' fairly vocal, not opposition, but wanting to go further, can he do it?
Well, I mean, if he's got the numbers, he can make any law. Any constitutionally valid law can be made if you can get it through both houses of Parliament. My view on this would be you can make a law. If it turns out the law you make has disastrous consequences, i.e. we run out of fuel, we get blackouts because we don't have base load, all the things that have been discussed before, and industry comes to a grinding halt. When those things happen, then you change governments and you repeal laws. So I have no problem with trying to reduce the use of fossil fuels. The problem I have is that no one has yet shown us how we can replace it in industry and how we can keep, if you like, the standard of living that we have.
Couldn't agree more. And I've said before, there's no green switch at the ready. These things have to be planned. We've talked previously about the lack of infrastructure, the lack of commitment to creating infrastructure to be that bridge between fossil fuels and green energy. It doesn't come readily made in a nice plastic package, does it? It's something you've got to work towards.
That's right. And you think about it, one of the nice, clean, green energies that could act as base load is hydroelectricity. And yet try building a dam anywhere in Australia. It's the environmental movement is so fragmented in, save the wombat, don't build dams. What about that frog? At some point we have to say, well, what do we want? And how are we going to do it? Like you say, plan it. Because the way we're going, we're just making laws, regulations, and saying, here's what we're going to do without any view of how it's going to work and how it's going to affect people's lives.
Well,
and of course, they won't touch nuclear power either. So, that's just been taboo, if you will, whereas drive around Europe, they're everywhere.
Yeah. We've just had the EU say that atomic power and gas was the way forward now. So, and one of the other things that I find a little bit hypocritical, while the government says, we're going to cut down all of these emissions, we still, I think we're number 2 or 3 as far as coal export goes. So while Australia only puts out a tiny percentage of greenhouse emissions, I think it's less than 1%, we're number 2 or 3 on the coal exporting. So the dichotomy there, the incongruency between we're going to cut down all of our emissions, which will make so little impact on global emissions, but we're still going to shovel all the coal out and take the funds in. It doesn't really match up, does it?
Well, that's the bit each way. Ian, that's your point that you were making, that they won't stay in power if they make unpopular decisions that start to affect the hip pocket nerve or indeed the quality of life. So, Ian, you were absolutely spot on. And I think that export of coal is right on the money in relation to that concept.
Well, there's another interesting thing is that more people die during cold weather than hot weather. So if we're going to suddenly say, you know what, we're going to bite the bullet here and we're not even going to export coal, what right do we have to prevent people from heating their homes or generating electricity to heat their homes that would put their lives at risk because of some ideology that we have?
Yeah. And also our gas exports, that's another one where we're sending it overseas. We're doing our best not to use it here and we're sending it all overseas. We're all in the one world.
And Michael, energy security, food security. We haven't thought about what's coming at us, and you know, the world and the landscape is changing so rapidly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let's call it what it is, with China and territorialism. China just has to lift its little finger, and we no longer exist as a sovereign state. It's that whole. We are potentially looking at that whole supply chain being devastated, not just interrupted. Maybe it will be here in Australia interrupted, but we have not focused on energy security. We haven't focused on the future. We've given it away without actually planning for a future.
You know, here in Victoria, Daniel Andrews recently went on with the fracking line. You know, I'm not going to have fracking on all these on all the dairy farms because of how bad it is, etc. That's just populist rubbish. And then if you, as you said, Caroline, what is vitally important is that we have food and energy security, that we can heat our homes in winter, that we can cool them in summer. It's just, I don't know, I shake my head. It just appears to be verging on lunacy. And then you have people like Andrews who trade on single lines of fear and fear mongering.
Yeah, 100% there. And we also need to consider we're coming into the European winter. There's talk now, Russia, I think, has already got one of their pipelines down, they're saying, for maintenance. But if they switch that off, are we going to say no to Europe if they want more of our coal and more of our gas?
Of course we're not. Of course we're not. I'm actually more concerned about what's going to happen in terms of wheat out of Ukraine. So I think that's going to have a devastating impact, not just in Europe. 20% of the world's calories are consumed through wheat. So if Ukraine's the breadbasket and they're not able to get that wheat out to the rest of the world, we're going to have those knock-on effects. And history has shown repeatedly what can happen when people don't have bread. Something is a staple, something as simple as that can topple governments. It can take heads off monarchs.
Yeah, and it can start wars, because if you can't feed your family, you go next door.
Exactly.
And what do we think about the Greens' rhetoric? And it's right up there about not supporting them. And I understand they can get through without the Greens. Are the Greens fighting a smart political battle here to get more power at the next elections and the Victorian state elections? They're looking like they may even increase their seats here.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. What you get to a point where you sort of think it's more about the politics and getting the votes and what the impression they're trying to make. And I just don't understand the attraction to a political party that is going to change your life so dramatically. As Carolyn said before, if someone had a plan and they lay out a plan and we're all following it, terrific. You know what? When they first removed plastic bags from Coles and Woolies, I thought, I didn't know what I thought about it. But one thing I do know is that I spend a lot of time on the water, and plastic bags in the ocean are a very bad thing. So having plans like, you know, putting deposits on containers and getting people to think about where their plastic goes and reducing the use of it, they're all good things. You can plan it, you can move forward, and you can have a positive impact. The fossil fuel one, it's just not like that. It's just, we rely on it every day. And the very Greens that want to get elected fly in and out of Canberra, burning how much jet fuel? It just, you know, you just think, what is this? You'd actually think it was a funny joke if it wasn't so serious.
Yeah. So, and I'm laughing because you've hit the nail on the head. And Michael, the word rhetoric, oh my God, it's so loaded. And that's what it is. It's rhetoric. It's not reality. It's words, and it's words designed to appeal to the inner city voters that don't necessarily understand the dynamics of why we need the power that we need to keep industry going, to keep farms going, to keep producing, to serve that lifestyle that Ian was referring to before, that we've all become so accustomed to. So by all means, let's buy into the rhetoric, but let's fully understand what that means on a day-to-day basis. I'd have to turn the lights and the heat off straight away.
Yeah.
It was funny, coming up to the election, I was walking past just Frydenberg's office, and there was a group of climate protesters out in front. Everyone's tooting their horns, and as I walked along, it was a big diesel BMW four-wheel drive with their stickers on the back. Climate Action Now had some of their placards in it, and I couldn't help myself. I went down and said, so what's the main thing we can do? Oh, reduce the, what about fossil? Yeah, terrible. I've gone, oh, the big diesel four-wheel drive down there, that's yours. No, it's not. Well, it's got your stickers on it. Oh, they're everywhere. Well, it's got your placards in the back. So what are you saying? I've gone, well, if you're not committed enough to do it, I'm here holding a placard. You know, we just need to be fair dinkum about this.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. What did someone say to me? I don't know where I heard this now, but it was what really should happen is that on the electricity grid, we ought to go into the electorates that elected the Greens and switch their power off for a period of time so that we meet our 43%. And then switch it back on once we've met the whatever the target is they want to meet.
Believe you me, after those terrible storms that occurred a couple of years back now, I sat here in this house for 3 days with no electricity. I had no water. The pumps weren't working to pump the water into the house. It was a scary process. And then to find out that people 10 kilometres up the road didn't have power for weeks. So we are so vulnerable. Power supply is the key to everything. Reliable power that you can bank on every time you flick a switch is what we have become so used to. So unless we have a transition that allows that 43% to happen, people are not going to be compliant. You know, businesses will not be compliant. So do we really want a government then to become the watchdog and the police? It simply won't work. There has to be a collective will to make it happen, because what the alternative is makes it so easy for everybody to transition. And that's the piece that's missing. And there's no planning and there's no thought being put into the reality. How do we get from A to B to achieve that? Making law is simple. Anarchy, however, can happen. And it does happen. And that's where you have riots, and that's where you have civil war.
Have a look what's happening through food shortages and corruption, etc., in Sri Lanka. That's what happens. The people come out on the street and say, "Okay, enough's enough." It's like, as I said, there are plenty of people that I know who the Greens would claim are, you know, environmental vandals, etc., because we're burning coal or we're using large amounts of electricity. We have some equipment in our factory that draws huge amounts of electricity to do the job it does. But the job it does is to produce a food for very, very vulnerable people lying in hospital beds who can't swallow. So, you know, what do you want?
And as Caroline so eloquently said, it's about the transition, and it reminds me of the transition is always where the problems are. It's like when my daughter was 3 years old, getting her out of the pool, that transitionary, and the temper tantrum and the meltdown. And it wasn't until we said, look, we're leaving the pool, but we're going to go get an ice cream. Then it'd be, oh, okay, yeah, we can transition to the ice cream. So I think we're at the temper tantrum stage now, because nobody is, it's become black and white. It's either you're against renewables or you're for them. There's no, the nuance where we're 100% for them. There's very few people who think that renewables aren't great, but it's that transition phase. It's doing it properly. It's making sure that once we flick that switch off, that there's something else to flick on. It's not yes or no. It's a yes, but we need this transition to be safe.
And, and sorry, Ian, I was just thinking of a transition that I've seen in my lifetime, and it was brought about by law, and it was brought about to ensure food safety. So once upon a time, we would turn up to the local Chinese with our saucepans, and there was no plastic, there was nothing disposable. The food was cooked and it was put into your saucepans and you took them home. But of course, you can't have that because you have laws. You create plastic, you create containers, because hell's bells, we can't just have anybody turning up with their saucepans to get food. Once upon a time, you turn up with your own bag to get flour put into it, for example. No, you can't have that. Food safety. So law has been created, and we've now ended up, if you will, with the knock-on effect by having food beautifully wrapped, completely sanitary, but creating a whole host of other problems in relation to the environment. So there is a cost for everything, but we now need to work out what is most important to us, what's going to keep us functioning. And then we have to work out what price are we prepared to pay.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. My father had a property up past Shepparton, and it was idyllic, smack on the banks of the Goulburn River in Undera, but too far, when he moved there, too far to get the electricity on. So the whole roof was covered in solar panels, and he had a generator. And inside they had an Aga stove. So cooking was wood, or you could use briquettes. If they wanted to wash or have, as in washing machine for clothes, or air conditioning to make it comfortable in the very hot summers, you had to run the generator. There was the solar panels, no matter how many you put out, they just couldn't generate what he needed as a base load, not without starting to cover large amounts of land. Now, that was just for two people living in a relatively small home. It's what I'd like to see is some reality about the science. I'd like to see people coming forward and explaining to us, if it can be done, how can it be done? If you can get base load using batteries, just show me. And I mean, I would listen to anything. I'm 62 and I've seen lots of changes come along. When I started in business, we wrote everything in a day book. Now we have computers. If I went between sites in those days, I would get to a site where the manager would say, Ian, here's a list of the people who rang because the last site said you're on the way to this site. There wasn't a mobile phone. We didn't have anything in the car. So you watch, transition, science has come and helped us do a whole heap of things. Just be open with it. Forget your 43%. Tell us how it's going to work. And then you can have whatever percentage you like, because we know we're going to move forward, and we know that the hospitals will run. And we know that, people who need to be warm in winter and babies, etc., it's all going to happen. And we're not going to have crisis upon crisis. But the way we're going, we will end up with a crisis because, as you said, it's a talk fest, it's rhetoric, it's a stroke of the pen. Forget the stroke of the pen, get the damn shovel out and show me how this is going to happen.
One thing I'm wondering if anyone has considered, I remember a proposal for the Amazon forest where they were saying, there's been several people who've bought up large tracts of the Amazon to stop it being deforested and farmed. I'm wondering if anyone have considered going to our coal reserves and going, okay, well, there's so many tons of coal in there and we're going to pay you so much per ton to leave it in the ground, and Australia's economy could survive on basically what we're saying is a carbon capture. We haven't burned it, we've kept it, and we want to be compensated for it, especially when the rest of the world is burning our coal and we're only contributing that less than 1%. How do you think that'd go over?
Well, the thing about that, Michael, is what happens wherever you're selling that coal to, what do they do? It's like Caroline's saying, there's got to be a plan, because what they're going to say, okay, well, we can't get the most energy efficient and cleanest of the coals, because you can have dirty coal and you can have clean coal. Our high quality black coal burns as clean as you can get coal to burn. Brown coal, which we have in your lawn and we've got 300 or 400 years supply, that's a dirty, that is what they refer to as a dirty coal. It produces more emissions. So if we say we're not going to sell our black coal, what then happens is the customers that we were selling to say, oh, well, we'll have to go and get a lesser grade and we'll just have to burn it hotter and make more. So this is the problem. As Caroline said, no plan, you'll end up in a mess. Sit down and talk about the science. Sit down and talk about where you want to get to and how you can get there without destroying lives, economies, etc.
And Ian, you've just hit the nail on the head. We're talking about lives and economies globally. We've now got to start addressing this issue as a global issue. So you can't just have one country doing what it wants to do and the rest of us suffering as a result. It's like when the world decided the ozone layer had to be preserved, exact same. And I know that people have been talking about that. We achieved that. Okay, but that was a very narrow issue. So we have a much bigger, a much more tangled and issue that we have to grapple with here. But again, we're not pulling together. We're literally now in that sort of almost like fright mode, and we need to let go of that fear. We need to start coming up with creative outcomes. Governments are not good at creative outcomes. They literally are sloganistic. They come up with that, as we said, the rhetoric to get the votes. Look what we've done. We've created a piece of legislation. Fantastic. So what you've done is you've paid a whole lot of pen pushers or computer operators with usually legal backgrounds to create a statute. Fantastic. But how is that going to play out? As we've said, in the real world, it's not going to. We now need to think of this as a global issue, and we need to help all economies survive it, survive that transition, whatever that transition looks like. And how you do that when you have ideologies that are so oppositional, and when you have, you know, the Putins of the world and the Chinese government and the Chinese military behaving in the way they are, good luck.
And also to the third world countries that are saying, well, hang on, you've already built your economy, you've benefited from all of this, and now you're telling us that we can't use this cheap, reliable way of getting our industries and our economy up to the level where it is with you, and no one's going to look after us. So we're going to leave it there. We're running out of time. So Caroline, Ian, thanks for a fascinating chat, and we'll see you next week.
All right, see you, Michael.
Bye.